Dr. Kolokytha, Ms. Bauer, Director Marshall Marcus, Professor Pelillo, ladies and gentlemen, it's a truly great pleasure to welcome you at the Diplomatic Academy Vienna for our event, Current Challenges and Opportunities for Cultural Diplomacy, the Case of Music. My name is Martin Eichtinger. I'm the director of the Diplomatic Academy, and I'm truly delighted that we have the privilege of welcoming the executive and artistic director of the European Union Youth Orchestra, Marshall Marcus, who will deliver a keynote address. And we welcome a very distinguished panel of experts in the field of music, which will be moderated by our own Professor Giulia Pelillo, head of the research area Cultural Studies. My own interest in this event is really threefold. On the one hand, and first, and for me most important, since 2021, the Diplomatic Academy Vienna has an obligation by law to include culture in its diplomatic study programs. An obligation which I welcome very much, as it confirms my conviction that culture plays a fundamental role in international relations and diplomacy. Secondly, as Director General for Culture and Science at the Austrian Foreign Ministry, a position I held for 5 years, I was able to witness the enormous power of music in overcoming divides and bringing people together, a truly unique tool of dialogue. And thirdly, as a board member of the European Union Youth Orchestra, I have been supporting the mission of the EUYO, the cultural ambassador of the European Union, for many years. I truly believe that the EUYO is Europe at its best, showcasing Europe's values in a very unique way. Ladies and gentlemen, music has been an essential component of human civilization for thousands of years. It supported social cohesion, created cultural identity, and facilitated emotional expression. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's famous quote that you all know, music is the most beautiful and at the same time the only language that is understood everywhere in the world, has not lost its significance. Music will always play an important role in intercultural relations. However, I think it is only appropriate that we ask ourselves which impact the current upheaval in international relations has on the relevance of cultural diplomacy, particularly in the field of music. I am therefore very grateful that this high-ranking panel of experts will take stock of the challenges and opportunities for cultural diplomacy. I would like to thank our partners, the European Union Youth Orchestra, the University of Continuing Education Krems, the Department of Arts and Culture of the Government of Lower Austria, the Austrian Music Council, and the University of Music and Performing Arts Vienna for contributing to today's event. I have to also say that unfortunately, 2 of our speakers of today have fallen ill. And instead of Dean Stöckler, I would now like to invite Dr. Kolokytha to say a few remarks on behalf of the University of Continuing Education Krems. Please, Dr. Kolokytha.
Thank you very much for having us here today. It is a great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about cultural diplomacy. I'm only here because our decanin, Dean Dr. Eva Stöckler, was unable to come, just to pass on greetings on behalf of her, on behalf of the university. So I'm here to pass the greetings of our Rektorin, Weber, also of Eva Stöckler. We're very happy to have the opportunity to discuss cultural diplomacy here today. I would also like to thank Land Niederösterreich and the Kulturabteilung, also for their support to the project Composing Change that we're doing in collaboration with the European Union Youth Orchestra. I think I'm just going to leave the floor to Marshall now. Thank you very much again, and we hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you for being here.
Well, I definitely need to introduce you, Marshall, because not everybody in the room might know you, but almost everybody. Marshall Marcus serves as Executive and Artistic Director of the European Union Youth Orchestra. He is also the founder and President of Sistema Europe. He is also CEO of the International Youth Foundation of Great Britain and ambassador for the Europe 101 Leadership Program and an advisor to both the National Orchestra for All and the Nucleo Project. A graduate of Oxford University and Cambridge University, he is a leading figure in international cultural cooperation. Marshall has spoken widely across the globe. His engagements include the Global Leaders Institute, the Belgrade Heritage Forum Rethink, Refuse, Reuse, the World Human Forum's Delos Global Gathering, the European Cultural Heritage Summit in Venice, Taiwan's National Kaohsiung Jung Center for the Arts, the Empress Theophano Awards in Thessaloniki, El Sistema's Global Summit, and a number of European Cultural Heritage Summits. Before founding Sistema Europe, he was head of music at London South Bank Centre and Royal Festival Hall, and earlier co-founded and led the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. Over the years, he has worked extensively with international organizations and networks, including the British Council, and has advised major initiatives in Europe, Latin America and beyond, contributing to the development of youth orchestras and cultural programs worldwide. Marshall is also deeply engaged in questions of culture and sustainability. He served as general editor of the European Commission's Voices of Culture report and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, reflecting his ongoing commitment to the role of culture in shaping a more sustainable and connected world. Early in his career, he enjoyed a distinguished 25-year journey as an orchestral solo and chamber violinist, which included recording and performing in more than 50 countries and collaborating with some of the world's leading musicians. Marshall was a member of the BBC Symphonic Orchestra, concert master of the Orquesta Filarmónica de Caracas, professor within Venezuela's youth orchestra system, leader of the Orchestra of St. John's, and executive director of the Endymion Ensemble. He worked for many years in music education, designing projects from primary to university level, and teaching at institutions including the Royal Academy and the Royal College. Over the past 13 years, Marshall has been instrumental in leading the European Union Youth Orchestra to becoming one of the world's preeminent symphony orchestras. The New York Times describes it as one of the elite organizations of its kind, and former EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker called it the best possible ambassador for the European Union. It embodies the values of the European Union and perfectly reflects the EU's motto, United in Diversity. Marshall, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. It's felt a little bit like one of those terrifying moments before death when your entire life is played out before you. Thank you for your words. Thank you, Olga, as well for you. And as well as thanking all of the various organizations that have helped put this evening together, I'd also like to thank Grafenegg, which is the home of the European Union Youth Orchestra, because without having a home there, we probably wouldn't have this session here tonight. So, current challenges and opportunities for cultural diplomacy, the case of music. Where shall I begin? I thought I would go through, as it were, 4 chapters this evening to talk about, first of all, cultural diplomacy. What do we mean by that? What is that? Then music. Why is music so important? And within music, in the case of cultural diplomacy, where would we go to something really powerful? I then want to move on to the whole idea of what an orchestra is and why orchestras are particularly powerful for this kind of area. And lastly, I'd like to just explore the question about youth orchestras and young musicians and young people and the power they have for cultural diplomacy. So the good news is that I intend to give you an extremely optimistic view about all of this now. We can leave the panel to then talk about all the challenges. But I do that because I'm such a passionate believer that what music can do for diplomacy is so extraordinary. I was thinking of the words of the Dalai Lama, who I believe said, if I'm allowed to teach meditation to every 8-year-old, there will be no violence in the world in 1 generation. Now, I'm not sure I'm quite as optimistic of that. My version of that is, if every 8-year-old played in a youth orchestra between the ages of 8 and 14, then within 2 generations, there would be almost no violence in the world. Such is what I would see as the importance. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we are in such a difficult space in the world today, as you know. Polarization, absolutism, not listening to others, the brute celebration of power. We see that all the time. I think you know what I'm talking about. And I think the point about that is that that makes this case, the case for using something like music and cultural diplomacy, not 10, 20, 100, but 1,000,000 times more important than it would otherwise be. Here I was going to say, I was just thinking of the Book of Changes, the I Ching. And by the way, I'm not going to quote Chinese all the way through this. But I was thinking the other day of this idea of where we are. And this book has 64 hexagrams that describe all of the world and the life that you need to know. Number 39 is Chen, C-H-I-E-N, and it means obstruction or limping. And the advice for that is that in a period of obstruction, don't go head on at something, but actually retreat and think and plan and strategize, know what you'll be, go inside, think about this. So I think this event is great. It's a good example of that. We have a massive campaign to do with the culture and the arts to help improve the world. So, case of music in this, let's just talk about cultural diplomacy for a moment. Let's take one time of definition here, the deployment of a state's culture in support of a foreign policy goals or diplomacy. By the way, you don't need to write any of this down, you can have any of these slides at the end. That's one definition with a source there. Here's another one. The exchange of culture with the intention of fostering mutual understanding. It's interesting to see how different those are and what different ways you can look at the whole question of what is cultural diplomacy. One is deploying foreign policy goals, the other is exchange and fostering mutual understanding. Now, there they are looked at in a different way, and I want to just focus on this thing to begin with. Foreign policy, cultural diplomacy, or cultural relations, diplomacy. And I think the point about that is they're often associated with whether or not it's a state actor that is involved, but they're completely different things. And I put my cards down on the table straight away to say what I think is the really powerful thing is the cultural relations, cultural diplomacy. We all know those stories of the New York Philharmonic going to play in North Korea, or in 1959 going to play in Moscow. They're great moments, but often when these huge diplomatic kind of things are put together with culture, they involve a lot of work, a lot of money, and the next day you wake up with a kind of a hangover and not much money left. And you know, what I think is really interesting in this area is to think about those things which work on a long term. To quote a Venezuelan called Maestro José Antonio Abreu, the short term is the enemy of the long term. And it's so often the case in diplomacy, as in many other areas which are affected by politics, that we're pushed by that. So I think that's a really important thing. Okay, let's think about music for a second, the case for music. Let's talk about why. Why is music so important? You very eloquently, Martin, gave examples of that. And I thought what I'd do is use a little bit of my university degree in experimental psychology. I never thought I'd be able to use it in this way, but it's very interesting. If you look at the human brain, you'll see that actually when you play music or when you listen to music or you make music, you are affecting unbelievably large numbers of parts of the brain. It's an incredible number. And, this is something I just put down simply to say, what makes music relevant, taken a little bit from a speech I did in Vienna about 2 years ago, you might remember Olga. And I've added diplomacy at the top there, but it's just one of many things. Now, why is music such a useful thing in so many parts of life? Back to the brain, but this time, if my pointer can work, I just want to take here to a little part. Yeah, well, it'll work here as well, I see. The amygdala, the hippocampus, and the cerebellum are all parts of the inside of the brain. And they're parts where the emotional impact of music makes itself felt. And this is a really important thing, because the point about music compared with many other cultural activities is that it gets right back down into our beings. It's a very fundamental, primitive aspect of our lives. People who might have Alzheimer's or have accidents and brain damage, often the one thing that they still can hold on to is music. If you play music from their youth, that will bring them alive in a way that almost nothing else will do. So that's a really interesting thing about why music is so powerful, the case for music. Here's somebody who's being very nicely affected by music. That's from a Harvard study. But it's just typical of, now it's very interesting for those who are not able to see the audience here. As soon as I showed that slide, people in the audience start smiling. It's contagious, this kind of thing. But music gets right into those centers, and for that reason it's very important. I'd like to try and show you a demonstration of that by asking you to imagine something. If we think about the way that countries represent themselves, there are three obvious ways I can think of. Number one is they have a president or a king or a queen or somebody who's a representative head of state. They have a flag and they have a national anthem. So I want you all to think in just quick succession here. Number one, just think about your own country's head of state and note your emotional state with that. That was interesting. That was very interesting. Okay, number two, think of your flag. Okay, that was a very different reaction there. Now I want you to imagine that you're listening to the national anthem of your country for a few seconds. Now, as a musician, I can just tell you something very interesting has happened. For the first time this evening, there's been a certain kind of silence because you're focusing in on that. And my point is that music is the powerful element. I always say when I talk to theatre directors of operas, can we please imagine an opera done without the music, just the thing? Not really, but we could do the music on its own. And I'm just trying to show that music is such a powerful effector. So, that's the whole point I wanted to talk about as to why music. Not quite sure why I put that slide in, but it's of some kids in Greece enjoying the European Union Youth Orchestra in Thessaloniki, but you can see they're enjoying themselves as well. What are they looking at? They're looking at an orchestra. And now I want to come on to the third area I want to talk about, which is orchestras. Now, it's so interesting, this. I thought I would use a nice example from Vienna, where I am. This is the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra in London at the BBC Proms. And I just want to talk for a moment about why might orchestras be such an important aspect of being able to push cultural development goals through music. You can see them there looking. What is it? Why orchestras? Well, it's what I call collective cultural cooperation. You see, look at that. There are about 90, and often can be more than that, 90, 100 people. They're involved in something unbelievably complicated, and they're all doing it together. It's cultural, it's collective, and it's about cooperation. And what could be more important in the field of diplomacy than some kind of device which helps cooperation in this way? I was just thinking, looking at that image, for example, that, you know, the orchestra there, they're always collective in the way they're cooperating in a concert. Nearly always. The audience, that doesn't always go for. I was just thinking about that hall, which is the Royal Albert Hall in London. I was at a concert there in 1968, the day after Czechoslovakia, as was then, had been invaded. And for the first time in my life, I saw a demonstration at a concert. The audience was shouting, and then others in the audience were shouting not to shout. The orchestra, which was a Czech orchestra conducted by a Russian, with a Russian soloist playing Czech and Russian music, you know, they'd just been invaded, but they could still do that. So I don't quite know why that's happened. I've got a lot further ahead than I was meant to do. Sorry, I'm just going to go back in. Managed to get myself about 15 slides ahead, which is quite impressive, actually. There we go. There. Now you can see everything I'm about to say. So, you know, what's interesting is, yes, audiences can refract, but not orchestras. That's the whole thing. Again, the guy from Venezuela I quoted before, Jose Maestro Antonio Abreu, he always said the orchestra is the largest device in the world created only from the point of view of communication, of joint communication. So that's, for me, why I think that orchestra is a really important thing. I was then going to show you, I just suggest you look at this. This is a TED Talk, which is really interesting, global power shift. It was done a long time ago, it must have been about 15 years ago, in which Paddy Ashdown, a UK politician and military officer, was talking about the fact that we're about to enter, he was saying around, I think this must have been about 2005, we're about to enter in a period when the most important thing is what you can do with others and your capacity to network with others. And I just see the orchestra as one of the great examples of that. Okay, now I want to talk about young people. Why youth orchestras? Because it's very interesting. If you look around the world, by far the most powerful examples of music and cultural diplomacy in practice come through some rather extraordinary youth orchestras that have diplomacy as part of what they do. The first one here is, you might recognize Daniel Barenboim, and that's the West East Divan Orchestra. I mean, this is an orchestra composed of people, you see them sitting there. It's an Israeli Jew sitting next to a Palestinian Arab in an orchestra. And I remember talking to Barenboim when one of the Gaza conflicts happened, not this one, but some years ago. And he said he'd brought them together, and his first speech to the orchestra was, look, if you're not comfortable, then leave. I understand that. And everybody stayed there. These are people who, well, I don't have to tell you, these are people who are trying to kill each other and are killing each other. So it's extraordinary that he could use music in that way. Interestingly enough, he always said that this is not an orchestra for peace, it's an orchestra against ignorance. Case number 2, the Afghanistan Youth Orchestra, an extraordinary, I'm going to keep using the word extraordinary because I think they all are. This is an orchestra of mainly girls, but not only girls, from Afghanistan, who were there to show Afghanistan music. And when the Taliban came in, they had to move. They were all smuggled out of the country. They're now based in Portugal. There's Dr. Sarmast at the front there down on the left who runs that. And that's another example, an interesting one of diplomacy through music. They're playing to show their country. It's a different one. The iCulture Orchestra is another orchestra which was invented around 2012. The idea was the EU wanted to look at the countries between the EU and Russia and look for ways they could be brought together, and it formed an orchestra. Poland was the initiator of this. That was the EU organizer, and there were young players from Poland, from Ukraine, from Belarus, from Moldova, from Azerbaijan, from Armenia, and Georgia. So those 7 countries. And I was teaching with them in 2012, and I had a very interesting example because I had these players and I was trying to decide which violinist to put next to each other. I had an Armenian violinist, and there were at that point border skirmishes, not war, but border skirmishes between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I remember saying, can I put an Azeri violinist next to that? And I remember talking to a high-ranking Armenian politician. I said, but can we do this? Can we put these players together? You're almost at war. It was very interesting, his reply. He said, I cannot say that publicly, but you must do it. And the point here is that, you know, this is the thing about music and diplomacy and young people. I wanted to call this talk Liquid Diplomacy, and some people said they'll think you're talking about alcohol. So I didn't. But the point I wanted to make was that music played by young people in these organizations, it's like liquid. It can go anywhere. It can get almost anywhere in a way in which states and politicians and diplomats find it more difficult. So iCulture Orchestra was a very interesting example, I would say, of that. This is the European Union Youth Orchestra playing at its home in Grafenegg, culture ambassador, preeminent culture ambassador for the European Union. You can see some of the flags there. I'm terribly sorry because you can't see all of them, and Austria starts with an A in the English. It's right at the left, so that's off stage. But you can see there that the flags are an important thing of what we do. They express this, as you said, Martin, so rightly, united in diversity. This is the West Balkans Youth Orchestra, composed of players from 6 of the West Balkans countries. Again, bringing them all together, only been going for a few years. This is El Sistema in Venezuela. This is a picture of them playing one of their community concerts. Note the extraordinary connection between audience and stage there. It's almost as if they could be the same thing. This is another, I'm not quite sure where I put that in actually. That's a concert from Wembley last year by Coldplay, when they invited members of the Venezuelan Symphony Orchestra to the youth orchestra to go and play on stage with them. I was just thinking, that's very interesting. You've got 80,000 people there, and they were prepared to listen to classical music, which rather amazed me. This is another aspect of El Sistema's work, which happens in Europe. It's called Side by Side. It happens in Sweden every year. They put over 2,000 kids from God knows how many countries together playing. It's a very interesting use of children from different countries playing together. And that is a project called WOW. So up to now, I've just shown you different orchestras. But this is a project that happened in 2024 in New York at Carnegie Hall, in which youth orchestras from 5 continents were invited. And this was a get-together of an orchestra of over 700 from about 36 different countries and 5 continents. And it's just so extraordinary how they easily played together. Here you've got the leaders of, from right to left, the USA National Youth Orchestra, the National Children's Orchestra of Venezuela, the Beijing Youth Orchestra, and the European Union Youth Orchestra. I think the next one you've got Chinese, African, Italian from the EUYO, all these musicians playing together. So it's really quite an extraordinary way of these things getting together. And one thing it showed me is that, of course, I put that thing of Coldplay in at a concert, and people often will go to Coldplay and say, incredible concert, it was amazing. But when kids like this play in orchestras like this, they don't just say, amazing concert, they say, this changed my life. And that is the power of music, can be used by diplomacy, by cultural diplomacy, I would say. This is just to show you that in Venezuela and El Sistema, they don't just have classical orchestras. These are Afro-Caribbean orchestras, Afro-reggae, Latin Caribbean, folk music, all sorts. It doesn't need to be classical music. That's the interesting thing, I think, actually. There's all sorts of ways this can be done. Right, I was just thinking, how else might this be arranged? Somebody should tell me when to stop, by the way, because I'll just keep going for as long as you like, or I'll stop when you like. Another 5? Yeah. Okay. So I was thinking how could we arrange some of these projects which I'd been talking about? How to categorize them? What makes them looked at in different ways as diplomat youth orchestras? Some of them are pre-conflict orchestras. They're there with the idea that they might help to stop conflict by helping integration. Others are post-conflict. They've been put there after something's happened to try and help ensure that it won't happen again. Some of them are even conflict mediation. They're ways that people who are at war are trying to work together. Some are more about social integration than anything to do with actual conflict between countries. Some are about validating identity. So I thought, well, okay, let me try and sort all these out. Which ones of those 8 I've just shown you would I put into these different various bubbles? And I've done that. And it's interesting to look at that. I mean, you look at conflict mediation, West East Divan Orchestra, I mean, those are people who are in the middle of a conflict, and yet they still seem to be able to play music together. How amazing is that for cultural relations? iCulture, again, was another one of those. As I say, I was faced in the middle of a project with the question, can Armenian and Azerbaijani musicians work together on a project? The answer, yes, they did. So you have those differences there. There's also a different way of trying to cut this. We haven't really talked about this so far, but there's this huge difference between state actors, non-state actors, and, if you like, mixed actors. So which ones are official organs of the state, which ones are not, and which have a bit of it all mixed together. And when I did that, I came out with this. I put El Sistema in 2 places because it's a kind of mixed actor. This is a very contentious point, but I'll say it's a mixed actor for the Venezuelan state, yes or no. There are a lot of arguments about that. But then I also put it into the non-state actors because all around the world there are hundreds of El Sistema projects here in Vienna. There's Superar, and there's El Sistema Austria, I think it's called. Now, if I look at all of those, can I ask you all a question? If I was to say to you, which one of those no longer exists? Anybody hazard a guess?
Which one?
No longer exists. Eye culture. Correct. The prize goes to this man here. I didn't bribe him for that, I assure you. We are meeting, but tomorrow. So it's very interesting that the only one that's a state actor is the one that no longer exists, or formerly a state actor. Now I'm just going to very quickly run through 1 year in the life of the European Union Youth Orchestra as an orchestral ambassador. Don't forget, the orchestra's main thing is to do these core concerts, but I had a look between April 2018 and April 2019. So in April 2018, the orchestra received a Cultural Diplomat of the Year award in Abu Dhabi. And then in May, it was in Alicante, where the EU had been given a prize. So they asked the EUYO to go and play there, and then it went to do some concerts in South America as part of the Year of Cultural Heritage, European Cultural Heritage. In May, it received the European Orchestra of the Year award in Dresden. It then went to play in Berlin in June to help this Sharing Heritage, Sharing Values project with the European Cultural Heritage Summit. In July, it was in the Wigmore Hall in London to help celebrate the Austrian presidency. That was very nicely arranged by somebody who was then the Austrian ambassador at the Court of St. James to the UK. That's Martin Eichtinger. You'll remember Martin. The stage did have more people on than that. I seem to have the wrong picture of the Wigmore. There were about 20 people on. Thank you for having arranged that. It then went in July to China as part of an EU project called Experience Europe. In early August, it was in Vienna, in the Stephansdom, where Manfred Honeck wanted to do a concert for peace. Hottest concert I think I've ever been to. And then in November, on 11th of November, at 11 o'clock, 2018, 100th anniversary of the ending of the First World War, the orchestra was at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, playing at that ceremony, which you'll see behind the conductor, Vasily Petrenko, there's all of the major leaders, 84, I think, major leaders were at. Then it was back in China in November later, where it helped to end the China-EU Year of Tourism. And then in January, it was at the Romanian Cultural Institute to help celebrate the Romanian presidency of the EU. And in April, it was in Brussels, celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Lower Austrian office in Brussels. So that's a typical kind of showing of an orchestra which has got its concerts, but it is also a diplomat around the world. And that last slide is simply the orchestra in Oman in 2019, and tells me that I've got to the end of my slides, so I don't need to say anything else. Thank you very much for that kind of introduction. I hope I've given a little bit of thought for you as the panel happens now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marshall.
Pleasure.
And good evening and a warm welcome to everybody also from my side. My name is Giulia Pelillo. I've been introduced already, but I'm the head of the research area Cultural Studies here at the Diplomatic Academy. And this evening I have the pleasure to moderate this panel on current challenges and opportunities for cultural diplomacy, the case of music. We have just heard an inspiring keynote that highlighted the richness and also the complexity of cultural diplomacy through music, from its conceptual foundations to the very concrete practices such as youth orchestra and international collaboration. Now we would like to build on these insights and explore them further by comparing different perspectives, namely policy, education, research, diplomacy, and artistic practice. And I'm very pleased to be joined by such a distinguished panel. I will start from my left. Martin Eichtinger, I don't need to introduce him, the director of the Diplomatic Academy, ambassador. Then Dr. Olga Kolokytha, who is the senior scientist at the Center for Applied Music Research of the University for Continuing Education, Krems. And from my side, right side, Dr. Eva-Maria Bauer, who is president of the Austrian Music Council. And Marshall Marcus. I don't think I need to introduce him at this point. But I would like to add that we should have had another panelist with us, namely Barbara Strack-Hanisch, who is Vice Rector for Academic Affairs at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna, who could not be with us due to unforeseen circumstances, but she has kindly shared with us some thoughts that I will introduce or I will share with you during the discussion. Now we will discuss in the panel for about 40 minutes and then we'll open up the floor to questions and comments from the audience. Now, I want to start with a broad question on continuities and changes in cultural diplomacy, and I would like to address in particular Marshall and Martin, who can bring the perspectives of diplomacy and that of artistic practice on this issue of when we talk about cultural diplomacy through music today, what has fundamentally changed in the last 20, 30 years? Maybe Martin, you would like to start?
Yeah. Well, I thought about it that I think overall, we are of course talking orchestras and classical music, but of course cultural diplomacy in the field of music goes far beyond classical music and far beyond also orchestral music. What has really changed over the last decades is, I would say, a complete transformation of the whole sector of music, because with the electronic and technological possibilities, music has gained a permanent availability. If you think about the possibility of streaming, I looked at some figures. Worldwide in 2024, streaming grew by 14%. And you really can say that this has, of course, on the one hand meant that for artists you have a tremendous global outreach. And on the other hand, of course, it has taken away some of the audience, because if you have a permanent availability of music, this changes the situation quite considerably. There's also a change, and now I go a little bit back to orchestra, concerts and classical music. In the audience of classical concerts, I looked at the numbers of subscriptions for classical concert series, which really go down. People have become much more spontaneous. They want to go to one concert, but maybe only book it the day before. You have a lot of interest in big events, open air. Events that basically also give you a kind of an overall feeling of like the Coldplay concert that Marshall showed. So also the event culture has really played a lot into this field of music. What I wanted to touch on, and this was personally for me also very important, and Marshall took a little bit away from what I wanted to say in terms of conflict and culture. Because during my time, when I was really working on cultural diplomacy in the field of music in the foreign ministry, we had 5 years of permanent discussions of the Director Generals of Culture in Brussels on the question of how can music and culture in general interfere with conflicts. And of course, as Marshall showed it with the orchestras, we looked at pre-conflict, we looked at conflict mediation, we looked at healing and post-conflict management. And in all this culture in general, but particularly also music can play a major role. Marshall mentioned the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, which of course is a role model, still exists now for, I guess, almost 30 years. And I think that there is a lot of potential, particularly what we nowadays need, because I should say this also, we have the largest number of conflicts in the world since World War II. And there are some institutions, like I looked at the Uppsala conflict data program in Sweden. They register all the military conflicts in the world. And we are now, in 2024, we were at 61, the highest number of military conflicts in the world. And I think when you see this, and when you see the power of culture and music, particularly in post-conflict scenarios, when it's about healing societies, then I think we should much more, in a very practical sense, look into the powers of cultural diplomacy and music in already now thinking about post-conflict scenarios. I had, when I was thinking about this and about my statement, I thought it could really be something also because we are, as Austrians, so much into multilateralism and into believing in an international order of international organizations, that this could really be something for the United Nations. I mean, Marshall knows, as I do, how difficult it is to fund an orchestra and to organize an orchestra and to keep an orchestra going. But I could think of a United Nations youth orchestra that really is specifically designed for post-conflict healing work in those conflict areas, with the young people from the region, from the warring factions, and really use this as an instrument of global diplomacy and of multilateralism. So this is something which now kind of struck me when Marshall showed all of this. By the way, I was a little bit surprised to see the European Union Orchestra under pre-conflict, and I hope that this does not bode something for the
Post.
No, you had it under pre-conflict.
Well, then I had it in the wrong place, yeah. It's interesting. It was actually... It was made in the ruins of the Second World War.
I hope this is not something that Grafeneck will be affected by. But no, seriously speaking, I think this is a very, very strong power of music, because after all, it's, as I said, it's a tool of bringing people together. But it's also, as Marshall pointed out, in our brains, it's about emotion. It's about identity. It's about personal feeling. It's about joy. It's about fun. It's something which very few other areas of culture can bring in this intensity. And so I think we should make use of music, particularly also for this very part of international diplomacy, which is pre-conflict management, which is mediation in a conflict, and certainly this process of healing and post-conflict management.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Marshall.
Yeah. Look, I can see forces from two different directions and going in completely different directions in the last, if you ask about the last 20, 25 years. On the one hand, I was referring to the kind of period we live in, which is very stratified, very rigid, very polarized. And I think that's meant that in some ways cultural diplomacy is a more challenging thing to do. It's interesting that, for example, if you look at the argument about should Russian musicians be allowed to work like sports people or not, clearly that hits a nerve with us. We say, well, that's too far. Would we have been like that 30 years ago? It's an interesting question. In the other direction, there's something that you mentioned, Martin, which is the whole field of technology. Because what technology has done is to democratize who the performer is. Imagine this from 30 years ago. You could go into your bedroom, your own recording studio, your own broadcast to the world. And so actually, and I didn't really touch on any of this, and I probably should have done, which is that the potential at the moment to use cultural diplomacy in a bottom-up way, which is people deciding how to use it, and for a change after however many hundreds of thousands of years of living beings, that there is the technology that you can do that if you're smart enough. So I think that is an absolutely massive change that's happened. And it's also led to, I think, a kind of an audience in the most general sense of an audience, which is, I'll decide as the audience whether I like this or not. It's not that there are kind of 5 or 10 concerts or whatever it is, and you can go to them or not go to them. The whole world is there, which has led, as you say, Martin, to the fact that subscription series are generally dying. People are deciding at the last minute because there's so many possibilities. So I think that that's really opened that. And what that means is that on the non-state actor side, it's very lively and there's all sorts going on. On the state side, I think it's, in some ways, to my mind, become a bit more impoverished. That's my quick answer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think you have already introduced the topic of, how to deal with geopolitical tensions and what to do at the intersection of diplomacy, politics, and society. And here, maybe I would like to turn to Eva-Maria and ask her a question about this nexus, namely, we have seen and we are used to think of music as a bridge builder, but there are some situations in which it becomes very hard to think of music as something apolitical. And so what do you think? Should cultural institutions take political positions, for example, in case of cultural boycott or when working with artists from countries in conflict? And where is the line between dialogue and legitimizing problematic regimes? I know you're getting the maybe the most difficult question.
I mean, your first question was, is it apolitical? Can it be a neutral bridge builder, right? And I would like to answer that with a counter question. Has music ever been apolitical, truly apolitical? Because if you look at it from a historical perspective, you see that music had a very important role to play in politics, actually. It was used as a tool for representation at princely courts, if you remember, or by the church as a tool for glorification. So there was also a very strong connection to the political side. Only with the rise of the bourgeoisie in the 19th century and the spread of the so-called secular music, it seemed to become apolitical. I say seemed to. And still, it has been used and is still used by fascist regimes for propaganda purposes, actually, and by resistance movements for protest. For example, what is punk music if not a protest movement? So nowadays, okay, we have many people who consume music without thinking too much of it. That's true. I think it's part of their everyday lives. But if you look at it from the artist's perspective, music is made by artists, right? And these artists are shaped by their environment, by the political, social, economic developments. They operate in a music business which is not detached from society, but rather whose structures reflect society. Think about the patriarchal structures or capitalistic mechanisms. So what I want to say to the first question is, artists are part of our society. They create their works influenced by the developments in our society. One of the art's most important functions, we haven't mentioned that, is to hold a mirror up to us, to be critical, to stimulate critical thinkings, to show us new perspectives. So if you take all that into account, how can music ever be completely apolitical? That's my answer to the first questions. And to your second question, how should cultural institutions deal with it? That's actually, I think, a very difficult question. In my role as president of the Austrian Music Council, I often think about it. I get a lot of interview questions, and I have really to think about when to make a stand and when to decline those questions. So, for example, we're discussing this again and again. Should we take a position when free media is under pressure, for example? Is this our sphere of influence? Or should we take a position if popular artists are accused of sexual harassment or violence, as has been the case with Rammstein, for example, or now in Austria with the duo Seiler and Speer? Is this our area of influence? Or should we take a position if right-winged parties threaten artistic the freedom of arts and science, or the diversity of arts and culture, because they undercut special fields of funding? So this is really not an easy thing to say. Or should we voice our concerns if big music events like the Eurovision Song Contests are used as a political stage, as happened in Austria with the discussion about excluding Israel or not from the Eurovision Song Contest? So these are very valid questions. And I think many cultural institutions tend to be on the trying to be independent, to be on the neutral side, and I understand that, I get it. It's difficult to step forward, but still, to my mind, we have an obligation to defend the basic principles of democracy, of human rights, of humanistic values. We have to voice our concerns, and sometimes we also have to take action. It's sometimes not enough to just voice our concerns or take a stand. I want to give you one example about the International Music Council. We are part of that, of course. When the Taliban got to power in Afghanistan, instruments were destroyed on a bonfire, you know. Music schools were burned to the ground. Music teachers and artists were persecuted. And what the International Music Council, which is primarily a lobbying organization actually, what they did was trying to save some of these instruments, to help artists and music teachers flee from the country, or help them to escape from prison. So this was really a thing where I thought, okay, we have to take a stand now. And just one last thought about when do we have to take a stand? Should we take a stand? It's always good if you have some kind of guiding principles for that, and we have that. I don't know if you know it, but there are the 5 music rights, which the International Music Council has proclaimed, actually. And I thought maybe if there's time, it's just 5 sentences. I wanted to read them to you to really show what it is about, because these are the guidelines that guide our actions and my decisions when to take an interview or not, actually. And these are the 5 music rights. First, the right for all children and adults to express themselves musically in all freedom. Afghanistan, for example. Second, to learn musical languages and skills. Third, to have access to musical involvement through participation, through listening, through curation and information. Fourth, the right for all musical artists to develop their artistry and communicate through all media with proper facilities at their disposal. So this concerns also state media and so on, and freedom to take this job. And the 5th thing is to obtain just recognition and fair pay for their work, which is also a big topic today. So that is my conclusion, although I can't answer your question if we should, comment on all this stuff. I think it's a decision of each and every cultural institution, but still I think we have an obligation to stand up for what is right.
Mm-hmm. I think what is most needed is not so much a definitive answer to this question, but probably a better method to address it, right? Instead of, attempting to come out with a definitive answer, try to understand, okay, what plays a key role in this specific context, and so what are the positions involved there, and what does it mean for the musicians, the institutions, the communities, and so forth. So to maybe develop a broader understanding also of these very polarizing questions too. So actually, my question was not aimed to, forcing you into a corner, but actually, as you did, to open it up rather. And also, what I thought when you were speaking of, should we need to stand for this and that, and also who is this we? And I think this is also an interesting question to unpack. And with that, I would then roll the ball to Olga, because I would like to ask you who actually drives cultural diplomacy today in terms of this we, right? So we have heard about orchestra and musicians, but then there are also institutions, there are governments involved, networks, and how do these different actors contribute in a way or another to do cultural diplomacy?
I think again, there's not very, very short answer to that. I think the we has developed through the years. It was interesting when Marshall started talking and gave the give some sort of definitions of cultural diplomacy. And what is cultural diplomacy? We used to say, and I'm talking about scholarship, I'm talking about academia, I'm talking about us who have cultural diplomacy as a research area, and we try to identify different trends, skills, issues in the area. At first, it was the state who was involved in cultural diplomacy. If you think about how cultural diplomacy has developed, also historically, you see a lot of it. For example, we see a lot of it during the Cold War, where there was this conflict, this tension between the U.S. and Russia. Everyone was trying to enhance their image, draw people to their side, impress the others, the foreigners, foreign audiences, through using culture. So we see that a lot there with the state using culture to achieve different sets of aims. Then this has developed through the years. This we has changed in a sense. Also because, the society has changed, socio-economic conditions have changed, the world has changed itself. Now we see that there's a lot of non-state actors that are involved in cultural diplomacy. In this, I also put cultural organizations who do not necessarily work with a state agenda, who do not cater, so to say, for the state, for state wishes, but have their own policies, have their own aims, their own audiences as well, and they do exercise cultural diplomacy. Sometimes, without even knowing they do so, you don't really need to. Sometimes organizations are involved in cultural diplomacy without explicitly wanting to do so. Mm-hmm. And this is an interesting thing for us to see, to research also. And then what has also changed, again during this process, during the time, is that there's also the civil society that is involved in cultural diplomacy, which, for me is also very interesting. Me as a scholar is very interesting. Now we have the civil society being more involved in cultural diplomacy goals. Again, sometimes not explicitly. Mm-hmm. People don't really understand that what they do is cultural diplomacy, but it actually is. And we do see a lot of processes. I think also Marshall mentioned that in his keynote. We see a lot of bottom-up processes. Mm-hmm. We see a lot of things coming from the people rather than coming from the state. So we see this shift from top-down to bottom-up, which is an interesting development to observe. Mm. Which also has to do with, I'm also using something that Eva used, the word democratization. It does have to do with a more, in a sense, democratized way of exercising cultural diplomacy. But this is also, making this we more brighter, I was going to say, wider, and also it enriches all the actors or the stakeholders who are involved in the process. I think it does. It is something that we observe in academia with a lot of interest. This shift and this, this shift with the way societies change and with which developments in the global landscape take place is something that we're very much interested in. And it does enrich the field, it does enrich the people who can exercise cultural diplomacy, and in a sense, it can lead to different initiatives, different ways of engaging people to the aims of cultural diplomacy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think it's very interesting what you say about the fact that many actors do not realize that they are doing cultural diplomacy, because this is something that we often hear in many fields of public diplomacy when you talk with scientists, for example, and of course with artists. And this was actually the question I wanted to ask Barbara Strack-Heinisch, because this touches upon the changing education that is required, or is it required? But yes, we could say it is required actually, of preparing all these different actors who work in somehow diplomacy in different fields to be, first of all, more aware of their role, but also of acquiring a broader set of competences to do this with a stronger awareness, and also according to what they want to do with that. And yeah.
Just wanted to use an example here of actors who unconsciously do cultural diplomacy. If you see, if you take festivals, small festivals, especially in areas that do have a lot of visitorship, can work as actors of cultural diplomacy. There are festivals that have been, that have started from citizens. I mean, are not part of any specific policies, cultural policies, not necessarily funded from the states. Even, I mean, some of the small ones are actually not. And you can see how gradually, I do have specific examples from that, from where I come from. I mean, from Greece, my home country. You see a lot of them that are developing and are attracting people who gradually come to a place to see the festival, who gradually become loyal audiences of the festival. And that actually works in favor of the area itself. I mean, in favor of the city, of the region, of the area they are based in, because they get to know the area, they get to know the place, they get to, they're more familiar with it. When some of them come through the years, I mean, very often. So they also get used to, they are immersed into the traditions, the culture, the customs. And that is actually cultural diplomacy. This is actually a way of exercising cultural diplomacy without explicitly having that in mind. None of these festivals, if you look at these festivals, none of them is actually saying that, yes, we are doing cultural diplomacy, but they actually do. Which is a very interesting example. I mean, the same happens in a lot of different regions, a lot of different areas. And it's usually small festivals who are very interesting, who are working in a very interesting way. And, you can observe how they do it. It's really an incredible example. None of them actually is explicitly doing, but saying they're doing cultural diplomacy.
Yeah, and this is, of course, a key question for us at the Diplomatic Academy, given that despite the name, we actually do not only train future diplomats, but many future actors in different fields. And so the question of, building or developing new curricula and thinking about, what are the skills needed for the generation who starts working now and will be active in the next 30, 40 years. What needs to be adjusted, what needs to change, and also this new research area is also a way of reacting to this in the cultural sector, but this stretches far over the cultural sector itself. And so the question that I addressed to Barbara Strack-Heinisch was precisely that: how should music education, in this case we are talking of the MDW, of the University of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna, how should music education prepare the next generation of musicians for a role in cultural diplomacy? What kind of diplomatic skills do musicians need today? And should conservatories and music university rethink their curricula? And she shared with me an answer that I'm reading to you. And so she said, from the perspective of the MDW, preparing the next generation of musicians for a role in cultural diplomacy does not mean imparting ready-made opinions or fixed narratives. Rather, the task of music universities is to educate confident, critically thinking artists who are capable of forming their own well-grounded views and meeting the world with openness and sensitivity. In this sense, musical education is about fostering reflective and independent artists within the field of music. Students should be encouraged to encounter different perspectives, question existing assumptions, and develop an awareness of the social, cultural, and political context in which they operate without being steered toward any particular ideological stance. What matters, therefore, are not explicitly professional diplomatic skills, but a combination of artistic excellence and social competencies. The ability to listen, you pointed to this earlier, to collaborate across cultural boundaries, to communicate non-verbally through music, and to engage respectfully with difference. And then she also mentioned the importance of expanding international exchange and also recognizing this experience through the possibility of getting the study you do abroad and knowledge in your own institution, and to create space. She also said, ultimately the task of musical education is to create a framework in which such encounters can take place freely and authentically. And I think this also intersects with what you were mentioning about, creating the right space for make certain encounters possible. Encounters that wouldn't be possible in a different context.
I think that's absolutely right. And, picking up what you were saying, Olga, I so agree with you that a lot of these festivals you're talking about, you could be talking about festivals, you could be talking about conservatoires, you could be talking about orchestras. There are all sorts of different institutions which foster. I mean, what she referred to those, reflective was one of the words. I know the Conservatoire Association were talking about, had a project called the Reflective Conservatoire. And so this notion, we can see, I mean, if you bring a lot of these things together, what you see is moving to a much more complex, fragmented world means that the skills that young people need if they're going to become successful, whatever it is, including cultural diplomats, is they need broader sets of skills. And I think that's the big thing. And once you've done that, then they'll find the spaces. Because, I mean, it seems to me that the biggest elephant in the room this evening is the nation state. So much of this is about what the state used to do. And as you were saying, Eva-Maria, in centuries gone by, music was used as an instrument of power. At the same time that in the palace or in the cathedral, it was being used for purposes of state power, it also occurred in the tavern as a kind of riot of free expression. So I think we've also got to keep in mind, I don't want to go back to this question of apolitical, but we've got to keep in mind these different polarities. And we've just got to recognize that in the current world we're in, it is fragmented. That's a massive challenge, but it's also a huge opportunity. And I like nothing more than those festivals you're talking about, Olga, where you see, you'll see a Latvian choir playing to a Portuguese rural audience who've learnt something about a different culture. And that listening and opening the ears, that to me is what successful cultural diplomacy is about. I'm almost, I'm a long way from the nation state here, which tends to often occur in our mind when we talk about it.
So maybe we could save the Eurovision Song Contest by removing the national flags.
Oh, I mean, to denationalize the Eurovision Song Contest, in my opinion, would be one of the greatest services you could do.
I agree.
Okay, we've got a plan today. That's good.
I would just like to say something about the possibility to also for non-state actors to conduct cultural diplomacy and to be active in this respect. One of the things where we also overcome the nation state is, of course, when the European Union comes in and supports activities. And I think where we all can agree is that Europe has this particular cultural mission that some other continents not have developed, in the sense that we are so proud of our cultural diversity in Europe. We see it as a major asset, although sometimes when you look to the economic sphere, the assets can also be a hindrance and the problem. But we still think that the creativity that emerges from this cultural diversity is just something which is absolutely unique in Europe. But then again, I think this is also something that we all need to work on, is that in the future, this cultural asset of Europe is not being lost also at the European level. And the next proof of the pudding will be when we see the next budget of the European Union, and also the ideas that come up for the next budget when it comes to the field of culture.
Yeah.
Because what is interesting is that the next program following Creative Europe, Agora, has a very different idea to it. And so this is something where we really need to look into. I'm now, particularly when you are interested in the field of music, you will see that all this is going to be very much blurred. Yes, also in the tendency to support small cultural initiatives, which again is good, because it really tends to what you said, that we will have many non-state actors. And unfortunately in Europe, and Marshall and I, we constantly, while we have a director of philanthropy at the EUYO, but I always, she pities me when you see how difficult it is in Europe to raise funds, to be dependent on philanthropy. This is, I sometimes have the feeling our state actors, because of the pressure, particularly in economic crisis situations where we were in, and to some extent we might energy crisis again be in, that the pressure is so strong, and culture is then always an easy victim. And while at the same time you look at the cuts in the cultural funding, where there is nobody really to make up for it, and we have to really look at the next European Union
multi-annual
financial framework, that culture is not only not forgotten, but that also music keeps its place in this whole program, because this is something which I think is really in danger.
Yeah, and speaking of Europe, I would also like to now focus on Europe, because Europe has long relied on soft power as culture as a form of soft power. Now, I would address now Eva-Maria again. How has this changed, or is it changing in the context of this increasing geopolitical tensions and the renewed prominence of hard power?
Very interesting and question. First of all, let's have a look at the recent developments in the European Union. You have already mentioned the Cultural Compass and Agora EU. And if we look at that, the European Commission has published the Cultural Compass as a strategic framework for cultural policy in the next decade. And the 20 flagship initiatives set very high aims. I'm just giving a few examples, like an EU cultural data hub, for example, or an EU artists charter on working conditions, great, or an AI strategy for arts and culture, or an update on the EU strategy on international cultural relations. So high aims, but, and here comes the critical point, with actually no funding behind these 20 flagship initiatives. So then we have to take a look at the multi-annual financial framework. And the interesting thing is that we see a proposed doubling of the EU cultural's budget, actually, in Agora EU, but not directed to specific branches like music or something. It's a little bit blurred. So that is what you were talking of, that we have to make certain that we are not, forgotten here. This third thing, I have taken part in a big political discussion in Brussels in February. There are lots of discussions now about this special topic, and I brought you a few quotes because these quotes were so on point that I wanted to read them to you. For example, Isabel Schwarz from the European Cultural Foundation, she really had a good point. She said, the EU can't survive as an economic project. It needs identity and community. Culture is the heart of European identity, but in terms of funding, we are treated as a hobby. So, very on point. And then she said, a cultural compass without funding is just a brochure. That was really good. So she demanded a position, actually, of culture in the center of this multi-annual framework. And as an investment in the future of the European Union, she demanded to treat culture as a strategic asset. In all important international speeches and discussions, she really wants politicians to use the term culture in every and each speech. So this is new. She actually said culture is a superpower. It's not a soft power anymore. It's a superpower because it fosters trust, community, feeling of togetherness and belonging, and of course identity. And this is at the heart of the European Union. So she sees culture not merely as a soft power, but a power of hope and resilience. And then she said something I really found wow. If we don't act now, others will define culture for us. And this is another thing which I found very interesting in this discussion, because many of the speakers, they really were referring to a kind of global war going on, like a war of values. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Nela Reid, the chair of the Cult Committee from the European Parliament, she said, what are we defending if not our culture as Europeans? There is a global war of values with Russia, with China, with the US, and culture is becoming a tool of warfare. So that's where we're at. And therefore, I think it's extremely important to support culture, to put an emphasis on that, although culture is a member state's responsibility, first and foremost. That's the next big elephant in the room. Yeah. But still, I think the European Union has to take a stronger hand or a bigger role in this. And then, I mean, it should also, I think, extend to the economic sphere. We haven't talked about that at all, because the creative sectors should be recognized as economic sectors. For example, think about the competitiveness funds. The funding is completely different. It's very high there, and cultural and creative sectors are not playing a role at the moment. So maybe the last thing I wanted to say is that the role of culture in diplomacy was also discussed in detail, of course, and it was the consensus that the EU has to invest more in cultural diplomacy because culture is the glue and the backbone of the EU. And another aspect is maybe that until now, the EU used the term values. They didn't talk about culture in the political discourse, not so very often. It used the term values, which is something a little bit softer, a little bit not so much defined, I don't know. And now in a time where there's a kind of cultural propaganda war, I'll say this as a quote, to assert values, I think talking about culture becomes a necessity and the primary focus for the European Union. Mm-hmm. That was my impression from this quite interesting discussion and the developments there. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think you have mentioned a very important point, because the power of music has been used not only for the good and also, for example, to go to war. And so, for example, now we see also the proliferation of, I don't know, rock music to celebrate the greatness of weapons, of super aircrafts and so forth. So I think we should be very aware of these two. So we are coming. Yes.
Just one word, because Marshall certainly remembers the long discussions in the board meetings that we had on values, and that the EUYO, we see it as the embodiment of ambassadors of European values. And this is something where we really can use culture also to spread our values. And in this system rivalry, as we call it, this is really where culture can present our ideas of values. And this is where we think that the European Union Youth Orchestra certainly has a great role to play.
I just quickly want to say one thing there, because, and it's been referred to actually, and again, yet another elephant here, but I mean, actually, you began to talk about it, which is, we're talking about using culture, everybody wants to do this, but of course it is used. I mean, take Beethoven 9, which is in some ways the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony almost kind of epitomizes this open, valued Europe. Well, I mean, Hitler used Beethoven 9 as a way of showing why Nazism was the great way forward. So it's what you're saying, which is that, there is a war over cultural values going on. And in many ways, that's the point, not to be left behind in that, I won't say war, but in that activity. That's the point.
And I literally just want to pick up on what you said and use it as a cue, because there's also, another elephant in the room as a term, and this is going to be endless, is the instrumentalization of culture.
Absolutely.
And it has, both a good both a positive side and a negative side. I think we've mentioned that. It is something, it has been used and is used, for a lot of different reasons, a lot of them positive, a lot of them negative. Now with all the discussion about the new funding frameworks, this has been blurring more and more. But whenever there's something that, we can use it again, this is immediately picked up upon and, used to remind us that, culture is our identity, is something that distinguishes us in Europe, brings us together and so on and so forth. But there is a big, instrumentalization of culture is a big elephant in the room as well.
Only a quick remark to this, because this is the most important and the most difficult situation that you're in as a state actor. When we remember the slides of Marshall, when he said, cultural diplomacy is also reaching foreign policy goals. And this is, in autocratic societies, this is called propaganda. In our situation, you have to walk this very thin line that you make sure that the culture that you are presenting as a state actor really reflects your entire society, and that this is really something where you present your country as a whole, and that you do not move into the field of cultural propaganda. So this is for everybody who has to take a decision as a state actor. This is one of the most challenging questions.
Yeah, that's true. But the good thing is that we don't only have elephants in the room, but also an audience. And so I think this is the moment to open up the floor and to start collecting reactions, comments, questions. So I would just kindly ask to introduce yourself briefly and then ask.
Hi, I'm Gil Rodman. I am the visiting Fulbright, not quite a Fulbright scholar here. Well, that's a story for another time. Thank you for a wonderful panel. I guess, contrary to what Giulia was just saying, I want to put some more elephants in the room. And I think I can stream a couple things together sort of quickly. But I want first respectfully but gently to push back at something that Martin said a few moments ago. There are very few moments at this point in time where I want to defend the U.S. But when you said that there is no place, no continent on earth that is as diverse in terms of music as Europe, I have to say something about the United States here. Which is a place where music from Europe and Africa and Latin America comes together. And, is at some level incredibly diverse. Now, that's not always something that the state wants to admit or acknowledge, but that we get something like jazz because we have the instrumentation of European military marching bands being picked up on by impoverished African Americans who play all those instruments, quote unquote, wrong, and make an incredible new music out of it that is only possible in America because of that combination, because of a combination of history of things that are both glorious and incredibly oppressive and ugly. And that in thinking about those kinds of music, and I'm glad that there was some discussion here of sort of bottom up and getting beyond classical music, and I was really glad to hear Eva mention punk. I want to put hip hop on the table here and think about, and this might be a different way of thinking about the difference between the state actors and the non-state actors, and different ways of thinking about what the panel has largely been talking about as cultural diplomacy, but thinking about things that people who don't recognize they're doing cultural diplomacy, but whether or not that's even the right term at that moment. Because what I'm thinking about the movement of hip-hop or punk or any number of other kinds of quote-unquote popular musics around the world, particularly musics of resistance, musics of protest, is they get picked up on around the world as forms of solidarity, where sort of folks in Palestine are hearing hip-hop, folks in Ireland are hearing hip-hop, folks all over the world hear hip-hop and think, oh, these are not the conditions of my existence, but they actually sort of are. And there's a connection here that matters. And that's about a kind of transnational sort of solidarity that is independent of those state actors. And in some cases, often even in opposition to them. I mean, I think that part of what I'm also hearing is all the way back to Marshall's lovely discussion of sort of these youth orchestras and, you know, who sits next to whom, is recognizing the gap. I mean, where those conflicts are involved, is those conflicts, as often as not, and this is one of the lessons of these sort of moments of musical solidarity, whether it's classical music or anything else, is that ordinary people aren't the ones who are necessarily pissed off at each other. You know, that's often the, you know, the agents of the state. I mean, yes, sometimes they are, but not always. And that some of what's sometimes not surprising, but also possibly part of what would be about diplomacy or solidarity or sort of something that's politically encouraging, is precisely the ways in which music of a variety of sorts can provide the opportunities to underscore that the conflicts here are not between sort of the people per se, but between, shall we just say, for the sake of being gentle for a moment, uglier forces.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. My name is David Dondoa. I am a former Georgian diplomat, formerly ambassador here in Austria and elsewhere. I'm the one who has used cultural diplomacy as an instrument, and quite useful instrument, especially for small countries, not wealthy countries, and especially if they are rich in culture and history. Besides, I was also for a certain period goodwill ambassador for the UNESCO Club of Athens in Greece. So my question is, it somehow relates to the gentleman's, is about, which was actually mentioned several times during different presentations, about a role of cultural diplomacy in conflict resolution and peace settlement. It's okay, I understand. We have used it many times, but my question is, what are the limitations of cultural diplomacy during the ongoing war? Mr. Markus, you have briefly mentioned this case of Russian sportsmen and artists, but honestly I did not catch what is your position. So if I may, if I may ask, how does culture correlates with morality during the war activities? Yeah. I'm not generalizing, and I'm far from the idea to stigmatize the entire nation because of failure of governments. But when when artists clearly are siding with the war party, and you Austrians
Easy
know
question.
who I have
You
in
have
mind,
1
first
minute.
and foremost. Their reappearance, occasional reappearance, does not contribute
Yes.
to the normalization, but on the contrary, they are polarizing the society.
Yes, thank you for asking me an extremely complex question right at the very, very end. This is a test of Occam's razor. I think the cultural morality, and you talked about this as well, is anything apolitical? I mean, I was just thinking when the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, I was in the midst of a project for a residency for the orchestra in Moscow with an artist who is extremely close to Putin. And it was very interesting that, what would have made, the residency in Moscow was out of the question, but what would have made working with a Russian artist at that point something which was morally acceptable or not? And we came down to this thing, which was what is that person's opinion? Not are you Russian, but what do you feel about that particular situation? Now, there can be another question about the fact that actually it should be nothing to do with that. This is just art. And, I think we agreed that life is never as simple as that. And we didn't stop having Vasily Petrenko, Russian conductor, as the chief conductor of the European Union Youth Orchestra at that time. But we stopped working with that particular artist. So the morality there came down to the morality, as we saw it, of the individual. But you're asking, obviously, we could have not an evening about this. We could do a whole doctorate about this kind of thing, morality. But I think what we are all agreeing here probably is the kind of situation, the kind of point you're making, Eva-Maria, which is that it's not easy to try and just get back into the culture box and say, not my stuff. And we've seen that. We've seen that happening. Look at someone like Gianandrea Noseda, Italian conductor, who is the conductor of the National Philharmonic in Washington, walking the finest of lines. This is an irony. As I'm talking, he's conducting Verdi's Requiem in the Musikverein, I think, with Zurich Opera. But I want to just say that every day he's going to have to be making moral decisions about, do I go with this or not? For him, in the end, he's thinking about the orchestra and what he looks after them. But that intersection of morality and culture is just another example of the fact that culture doesn't live on a pedestal, on a high podium. It is life. It's not something that does stuff for life. Does that answer it in any way? Whew. Okay.
And if I can add to that, what you were saying, there was, again, when the Russian invasion in Ukraine first took place, there was this huge, movement, this huge thing with Russian artists being banned from, cancelled, stopped from performances. I mean, there was a huge thing. There was a lot of cancellations, a lot of changes in casting all around the world. And that was really going on for some time. Mm-hmm. And at some point, it sort of backfired because there were people who were artists who just happened to be Russian, but not necessarily, in contact, in good terms with the state or whatever. And that sort of backfired in a lot of different ways. What I'm trying to say is that morality is, there's a thin line when we talk about morality and, in what kind of situation are we looking into and what particular context this is used.
So we are already over the time, but there is just one question there I would like to pick, and maybe if you make it as brief as possible.
I will try. Philipp Stein, I'm working with an artist agency in Vienna, and what I think is very interesting about the morality question is that arts and especially music always puts itself when it's in need of money or in need of audience or in need of representation to its high moral standards, and it's so impressed by itself how high the moral standards of the pure arts are. And then when it comes back to I have to pay my musicians, and that's why I'm somehow sympathizing with the regime, and I'm not really political, but it's only about my musicians that I have to pay for. It comes to completely different standards. And I think this would be something that music universities actually have to address, that most of the people that end up coming out of music universities have a lot of know-how, but have very limited know-why, and that's a real problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, very briefly. There is an.
Thank you very much. My name is Christian Hanus from the Danube University, Krems. Yes, the last minutes of the discussion, I have the whole time thought about the situation in the film Casablanca when the people in the restaurant is singing Marseillaise and Wacht am Rhein, this musical fight. This came in my I thought about it. But concerning this morality of the people, we have an experience. At 5 years, we are organizing an international orchestra academy in Accumoli. It's a small city in central Italy destroyed by earthquake 10 years ago. And we begin with this academy with international musicians, and they are playing together with the local bands. And what they developed in the enthusiasm, and before they had a lot of conflicts, yes, the conflicts are also today here, but they have the moments to organize something together, and also they have a new motivation to support the process of reconstruction. That was a great experience. I'm not a musician. I have played a little bit piano, yes, but I'm coming from the construction, from the engineering, from the architecture. But this was an impressive experience for us, and we have seen the music is a very, very strong catalyst of the process, and that is so impressive. And I have learned to this evening a lot. So best compliments to this event, this evening, to this discussion. Thank you very much to you all.
Thank you. And so we are already at the thanks moment. So before we conclude, I would like to also express our gratitude to the Land Niederösterreich, the provincial government all over Austria, Department of Arts and Culture, for kindly supporting this event. And of course, a big thanks to Marshall and to the panelists for this great discussion, and to all of you for coming and participating and sharing your thoughts. So have a very good rest of your evening, and thank you.